I think security is a very fundamental value or state of being for human beings. If you think of what are the most disempowering states in your life, it's the states where you are most insecure, when somebody you deeply love suddenly dies, or when you lose your job. So I think that whole debate that kind of tries to put privacy and security against each other is really false. You need to have a certain sense of security to be able to use the internet, to be able to be fearless in what you do on the internet. I think the problem with some of the ways in which the current debate is framed is that it makes it sound as if cybersecurity is something that's outside of people. And as a consequence of that, it's something that the state provides on behalf of people, and you just have to believe that whatever they decide is true. And as a consequence of that, people have had to give both the tools and the agency to make sure that they can keep themselves secure out of hands. Because cybersecurity is mostly conceptualized like that. It looks as if security online and privacy are opposite to each other. But actually, to be really secure, individuals should have the tools to make those decisions again themselves. And if they have the tools to make those decisions themselves, that means they can also decide how much they want to guard their privacy. So there seems to be a contradiction between the two. It's only because there is a faulty understanding of what cybersecurity means, at least if you approach it from a human rights perspective. Having the cybersecurity debate become more and more important was a real challenge for civil society, I think in part because many of us who are focused on human rights in particular aren't necessarily techies. And so when you have, for example, a conversation with a government bureaucrat and ask questions about the kind of decisions they decided to take, very often they will come up with a very technical answer in response. And then if you don't have that expertise, it's difficult to react. So I think partly the complexity of the cybersecurity issues in a technical sense was a kind of a damper on the enthusiasm of many people to get into this area too quickly. In the meantime, though, I think it's become clear that this is one of the biggest issues in the internet field at the moment. It's also one of the big issues that has been driving the desire for governments to have a bigger role to play in internet governance and to decide more how internet governance, be it globally or nationally, plays out. So it's become an area that's kind of unavoidable now for activists. I think, though, what has happened slowly is that we've come to realize that the first thing, as in most other areas, is actually not the technical details, but still principles. And those principles are fairly similar as they are in many other fields. So when it comes to cybersecurity, even if I may not understand all the technical details of what a bureaucrat tells me is needed, I can still ask questions about how checks and balances are built into a system, and I don't need to know the technicity or the technical details of things to be able to do that. But it's been a much slower conversation. I think free speech was easier because it's a more social, societal, political issue, so it was easier to get into. The big things about the whole cybersecurity debate at the moment is that governments have actually helped creating a real definitional mess. And so the sense that governments and civil society are somehow opposed to each other in this debate many times comes from there. And when I say definitional mess, I mean that anything and everything that could remotely be a crime that uses the internet in some way is somehow clubbed under that debate. So you have attacks on, say, critical internet infrastructure, you have any malware or any fraud on the internet, and then you have more traditional crimes like, say, child pornography or the illegal downloading of content. Now, that last category are crimes that actually existed before the internet existed as well. They might take on a slightly different shape right now, but they don't need the internet to be there. And I think one thing that happened in this whole definitional mess is that we forget that for this last category of crimes, we actually already have solutions in many ways. We've thought through quite a bit what should be our responses to content-related crimes online, etc. And I think the problem is more that governments don't implement the recommendations consistently. They can act, though, as if we don't really know the answers to that either, because some of these bigger problems, which also in technical terms, again, are much more complicated and more difficult for lay users to understand, have not been addressed effectively necessarily. And by kind of clubbing all of that together, the sense of alarm that comes with the worst possible threats, which in India would be cyber attacks from outside of the country that would really put down the whole country, or take out of functioning the whole infrastructure, that whole sense of alarm has kind of affected the whole debate. And in the debate, I think, because of that also, surveillance is often held up as a solution, as part of that larger package. But when you look at it actually in detail, surveillance in many cases is justified by governments for crimes that pre-existed the internet, and not necessarily to prevent things like attacks on critical infrastructure, for which you actually need the protections or encryption to be higher rather than lower, because if the protections there are lower, the vulnerabilities of the system are much bigger. So you see that there is a role of governments, I think, in this whole debate, which is very contradictory, and you can even say duplicitous. And one would need to look in much more detail at different aspects of the debate to be able to say where is there commonality and where isn't there. And where is there a real power play in place of governments, a real attempt to kind of try and take control over things which actually weaken the system overall rather than strengthen it. So big problems like attacks on critical infrastructure, many I think will agree that protections for these things need to be put in place. But the contradictions with some of the solutions that are put forward by governments for other problems which they claim to be cybersecurity problems first need to be investigated in greater depth. And I'm sure if we do that, we come to the conclusion that surveillance should be far less, not more. We actually did research on this whole question of women and online abuse at the Internet Democracy Project, and we specifically looked at the kind of abuse women who are vocal in a public way online get and how they deal with it. So one of the things that a lot of the women in our study said explicitly was that they looked at the internet as a street. And like you have a lot of street sexual harassment, you also have a lot of harassment on the internet. And so if you're loitering around, then you will have to prepare for that one way or the other. Also, like on the street, they said initially you might not be prepared for that, and so you'll be very open both about what you think and about where you're going and what you're doing. And after a while, you just learn not to talk about certain things. Some people will, of course, say men also get abuse online, and that's true, but I think the abuse women get is very different. And almost everybody in our sample had, for example, had rape threats, and some had depth threats as well. And even though you know that the chance of that happening is fairly slim in many cases, once you've had a rape threat directed at you, it still makes you think twice. And you will still be a little bit more careful next time. So I think psychologically, unfortunately, it makes a difference. And women will be careful in a way that men don't necessarily have to be. There's a relationship between human rights and everything. So definitely also technology. Human rights are a framework to look at the world, right? And I think with the development of the modern nation state, it's a crucial framework to mediate the relationships between citizens and the state. Information technology, as we've seen over the past decade, has radically changed that relationship. And so the implementation of human rights and a strong protection of human rights has become even more important than before, precisely because of that reason. So this question of whether anonymous speech detracts or enhances free speech, I think in a way is irrelevant. The reason being, it obviously does both. Like we can all see that every day. But people ask the question because they somehow want to hear a judgment on whether that means whether we have to do away with anonymity or not. And that's where I think the irrelevance comes in. If you believe that we need to have a right to privacy, and I define privacy as being able to make a decision yourself on how much you want to reveal, then obviously you need to have a right to anonymity. Because without the right to anonymity, you cannot really have the right to privacy. Because as part of the right to privacy, you have to be able to decide that you do not want to reveal anything at all. So if you would say that we can't have anonymity because it's bad for free speech, if that's a line you would take, then I think you're fundamentally undermining another right, and that can't work.